I'd like to talk about a little bit of economic game theory now, as it refers to and relates to coordination between specialists. One of the biggest problems we have underlying the frictions that impede coordination is the idea that various coordinating parties rarely have perfect information regarding the intentions of the other parties with which they are attempting to coordinate. There's a very fancy piece of economics for which a Nobel Prize in Econ, or more specifically the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economics, was awarded to an economist in 1970 for his work in the 1970s on what he called the market for lemons. Akerlof's work on this showed that when the buyers of a used car are unfamiliar with the quality of the used car, that they will tend to underbid in a way that protects them from the possibility of malinvestment. And the general result of this is that if people can't tell a good quality used car from a bad quality used car, that they will only offer low prices commensurate with a bad quality used car. And this, of course, creates a situation where people who have good quality used cars can't sell them for their full value in the market. If we iterate the results of this over and over again, what starts to happen is that people with bad quality used cars flood the market because it's full of suckers who will buy it in case it might be a good car. And meanwhile, everyone with a good car leaves the market. Inevitably, this ends up with the public market simply being full of frauds and poor quality vehicles, which ultimately leads to market failure. Akerlof's solution to this, of course, was a third-party verifier, someone who could certify the quality of your vehicle before you buy it. As anyone who's ever bought a used vehicle is familiar, the concept of a mechanical fitness test is important to resolving this informational asymmetry between the buyer and the seller. Now, when we have multiple interactions, not like those that we see in the lemons game, we notice that other tendencies tend to emerge as opposed to simply people trying to maximize their private benefit in a single period game. We see people self-interest being tempered by notions of reciprocity and reliability. How often will I be able to do this kind of exchange with the same party in the future if I rip them off the first time? If I rip them off the very first time, there's unlikely to be a second interaction. And therefore, while that might be a viable strategy with millions of potential counterparties, in places like small towns or even within households, it turns out to be a lot less efficient because people remember how you behave, and people remember if you took advantage of that information asymmetry or not. In another piece of game theory, what we called the evolution of cooperation, Robert Axelrod identified back in 1981 that there are potential gains from coordination as opposed to simply serving one's own best interest while trying to pursue an optimal resource allocation. He identified in the evolution of cooperation that in a repeated interaction situation, that the superior strategies that had the best yields involved memory, remembering who had worked with you in the past and who had betrayed you in the past, as well as, interestingly enough, the concept of forgiveness, the idea that sometimes people will make mistakes not by intention, but sometimes due to genuine human error. And that needs to be taken into account when we're considering the reliability of our exchange partners. Now, one of the important ways that we have for overcoming this type of information asymmetry and for overcoming the concerns that we have that our transacting partners might not share our best interest has been to limit the pool of who it is that we transact with. Early on in human history, human societies tended to be almost exclusively related by blood. We had tribes and clans of people who were tied together by their genetics and therefore did have some kind of common tied shared interest. And we identify these sorts of things very early in the anthropological records. For instance, you may be familiar with the often misattributed quote to Margaret Mead that the earliest signs of civilization involve the signs of a broken bone among the Stone Age inhabitant, which had been mended. In the wild, a broken leg often leads to instant death. But in a society where we care for one another, a broken leg may actually be mended over time so that someone can return to productivity. Now, typically speaking, in the natural world, random animals don't help each other. And in human civilization, strangers don't tend to help each other as often as we might like. Instead, people tend to gravitate towards those that are of similar kind to them. that have some kind of bond of affiliation that may go beyond simply their genetic ties, but also may include things like ethno-linguistic ties or cultural religious ties. People have, how do we say, a commonality with those, or share a commonality with people with whom they have the same nationality or the same profession, or maybe you're even just part of the same sororal or fraternal communities. These types of bonds of association work to reduce information asymmetries and improve reliability because they often come associated with different kinds of cultural norms, customs, and behaviors, which ultimately increase the predictability of other people's actions, which reduces risk and encourages entrepreneurship. Now, of course, these types of connections, these dimensions of affiliation, effectively offer what we call a form of fast trust, which allows us to identify very quickly people who we think we might be able to work with because we believe that they share some of our interests. And this, if true, would reduce the costs and challenges associated with coordination. Now, of course, anyone who has studied social sciences will recognize that this is effectively a form of privilege, where we privilege those who are like us because we believe that they have the same interests as us. And it's not always that we necessarily friction others intentionally. It's that we de-friction people who are like us. And this can create a variety of problems on top of the formal frictions we impose in some societies as we try to keep people down. Now, of course, families aren't the only unit, as I was mentioning. We also have to consider the notion of an extended family. The idea that people might look beyond those groups with which they have what economists call an untraded dependency. And in some cases, we see that this has extended to include much, much broader communities, as I was mentioning earlier, around professional groups, or around communities of choice, or even around such broad notions as ethnicity, or nationality, or linguistic group. As humans got around to traveling well outside of their homelands over the last several thousand years, one of the things we noted was that they retained these bonds of affiliations as they moved into new lands, creating effectively what we call a diaspora network, where there are people with whom you do share affiliations who have gone far and wide. And if you follow these people into these areas, they may be able to de-friction the process of acclimatization for you. Most immigrants are familiar with this notion that they will affiliate with their local communities when they move to various places. As an example, when I used to teach in Hong Kong during the summer, it was very easy to connect with any of the 300,000 Canadians who live in Hong Kong while I was there for a month. And even though I didn't know any of them personally, there was still a bond of affiliation associated with the notion that we came from the same legal jurisdiction. This type of thing happens all over the world and throughout human history. In fact, several diasporas have used this as the foundation for international business networks. And we see this in the Italian community, the Cantonese community, the Jewish community, the Armenian community, the Lebanese, the Gujarati, the Teochews, the Scottish, the Hokkians. This happens all over the world, where people create these kinds of international bonds of association in order, rather they exploit these bonds of association in order to be able to create business networks. Because one of the most advantageous uses of this kind of fast trust heuristic is in the coordination of specialists. And therefore, we see these kinds of extended family networks around the world in a number of different kinds of communities. Now, lest anyone think that there is a free ticket to ride simply because you are Gujarati or Jewish or Armenian, it's important to know that a lot of people have attempted to free ride on these networks well into the past. And so many of these types of closely knit business networks often have some kind of verification that they will use against fraud to protect themselves from letting in bandits into their otherwise circle of trust. And for this reason, you'll find that references, particularly from close family members or other associates, are very important when moving into new communities. It can make the difference between a difficult frictional existence and one whereby you can more readily access the surplus created by specialists. Another community that seems to be of particular importance throughout financial history is the community of faith. Due to the intensity of the norms that normally go along with religion, co-religionists effectively resemble a super extended family. In fact, in Islam, there is the formal term for this is the Ummah, where you have a network, effectively, of all Muslims around the world who participate in a common community of faith and are expected to treat each other in particular ways, in ways that are different necessarily than those who are outside of the community. Now, this is not a new concept. In fact, 5,000 years ago, Sumerian city-states organized their economies around temples, which redistributed production to the population. Effectively, religion for them was the nexus of their common economic interests. And we see that faith continues to play a role in economic allocation thousands of years later. In the 1600s, a number of European colonial corporations were in fact faith-based. La Compagnie de Nouvelle-France, the Virginia Company, and many others focused not only on trying to settle new lands, but also converting the locals, not necessarily just because they wanted to save souls, but because doing so facilitates economic interaction and specialization by building up bonds of trust. And this is often overlooked when people review the history of colonialism. They tend to look at the idea of forcing other people to join a religion as being making you like us, without considering necessarily the advantages. And we see that in many cases, the French in early Canada actually adopted a number of cultural ways of their First Nation trading partners, pursuing the exact same mechanism of building up an extended family around the notion of accepted and common norms. And religion has been an important vehicle for this throughout the world for thousands of years. We actually see the spread of Buddhism out of India into Central Asia and along the Silk Road, carrying Buddhism into China, and along with it, a number of important financial technologies, in particular, collateralized lending. The spread of Islam in the early years of Islam, in the 7th to 9th century, largely happens at first because of military conquests of cities, but afterwards by the notion that traders who are moving out to small oases and out to small different groups who are living outside the city adopted Islam and carried that religion out of the cities into the hinterlands. The main reason for doing so is because it presented a series of cultural and economic norms that merchants could use to make each other's behaviors more predictable. It also provided for them the notion that because there was a commercial code built into Sharia law, any holy man effectively could act as a judge. So rather than having to travel to large centers like Damascus or Baghdad in order to resolve commercial disputes could actually be resolved by religious authorities, which were a lot more accessible at the time than necessarily legal authorities were. We see the same pattern emerging in Protestantism, quite frankly, in the last few hundred years, where the spread of Protestantism very closely overlays with the Hanseatic League's trade networks along the Baltic and North Seas. And so throughout human history, faith has been an important way of providing this type of extra large family network, a super extended family, whereby co-religionists will tend to give each other the benefit of the doubt more than they will who necessarily follow different faiths. And this can, of course, create opportunities for fast trust, which facilitates economic allocation and coordination among specialists. Finally, on this topic, we have to consider the role of what economists call externalities. Externalities are what happens when the benefits and costs of a particular kind of coordinated activity are accrued to unrelated third parties. And this can be particularly problematic. For instance, if me and my neighbor have a particular deal worked out, but it creates a problem for my next door neighbor as opposed to the one across the street, then we've created an externality for my next door neighbor who might be bearing the costs associated with me and my neighbor across the street's coordination. Now, when people have bonds of affiliation, they are less likely to be willing to impose those externalities on others. We, as general, seem to be okay with, say, sending our plastic from Canada to the Philippines to be recycled, but we'd be a lot less keen if we were keeping all of that within our own country. We seem to think that the externalities associated with pollution are less of a problem when they affect people with whom we don't have a bond of affiliation, but are much, much more important to be concerned with when they affect others who are like us. And so there may actually be significant gains to attempting to redefine what constitutes us. And this is one of the big gains of nationalism. Despite the political complications and the conflicts that arise from nationalism, the notion of creating a huge community whereby people have some reasonable expectation of reciprocation from others in the community facilitates national scale economics as opposed to simply local scale economics. And for that reason, it may be important for us to try to build up different kinds of affiliation within organizations and between different groups in our wider society if we hope to try to limit the costs associated with externalities.